Good evening and welcome back, wherever you may be listening from tonight. Whether it's a quiet bedroom lit only by a small lamp, a pair of headphones resting gently against your ears, or a dark room where the outside world has finally gone silent. And before we begin, take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Because it's always comforting to imagine these stories traveling across cities, countries, and time zones, quietly connecting us all. And if you enjoy this slow, peaceful way of exploring history, if these stories help you unwind, relax, or fall asleep, consider giving the video a like and subscribing, as it truly helps this little corner of calm history continue to grow. Before we begin, allow yourself to get comfortable. Loosen your shoulders, rest your head just a little deeper into the pillow, let your breathing slow naturally without forcing it. And if your thoughts are racing, don't try to stop them. Just let them drift past like distant lights seen from a train at night, knowing that nothing else is required of you right now except to listen and to rest. Tonight we are traveling back to a winter that was cold, uncertain, and quietly historic, to a Christmas that did not sparkle with abundance or laughter, but instead arrived softly, almost timidly, in a city that had endured more than most, a city that had only recently begun to breathe again, after years of fear, hunger, and occupation. Because this is the story of what Christmas was really like in Paris in 1944. Imagine Paris in December of that year, its streets still bearing the invisible weight of boots that had marched through them for 4 long years. Its buildings darkened by coal smoke and rationed electricity, its people thinner, quieter, and more cautious than they once had been. And yet, beneath the grey winter sky, something fragile and unfamiliar was returning, a sense that the worst might finally be over, even if no one dared say it out loud. This was not the Paris of overflowing shop windows or glittering cafes filled with music and wine, but a city where bread was still scarce, where meat was a memory more than a meal, where families counted their ration cards carefully, and where Christmas preparations were made not with excitement, but with patience and restraint, shaped by years of survival rather than celebration. Only a few months earlier, in August of 1944, Paris had been liberated, and although the German occupation had ended, the war itself was far from over, with fighting still raging in the east, shortages still severe, and uncertainty lingering in every household, making Christmas less a feast and more a quiet pause, a moment to acknowledge endurance rather than victory. In small apartments with drafty windows and thin walls, families gathered close to conserve warmth, candles flickering on simple tables, their light reflecting off chipped plates and worn cutlery, as parents tried to recreate fragments of older traditions from memory, telling stories of Christmases before the war, when oranges were plentiful, when sugar was not precious, and when the future felt less fragile than it did now. And it is here, in these modest rooms among whispered conversations and careful smiles, that the true story of Christmas in 1944 Paris begins, not as a celebration of abundance, but as an act of quiet resilience, a gentle insistence on normality in a world that had been anything but normal for far too long. Outside, the city was wrapped in a deep stillness that only cold can bring, the kind that softens sound and slows motion, turning every footstep into a careful echo between the narrow stone walls. Street lamps flickered faintly under a thin fog, their light dimmed by years of neglect, and in the small courtyards behind old apartment blocks, people still hung laundry that froze stiff before morning, while the faint scent of coal drifted through the air like a tired memory. For most Parisians, this Christmas was not about gifts or feasts, but about warmth, the warmth of a single candle, of shared soup, of someone's hand resting quietly over yours. Firewood was expensive and scarce, so families learned to make do with what they could find. Broken furniture, old crates, anything that could burn was precious now, and the sound of wood crackling in a small stove was almost sacred, a sound that meant survival. The markets that once overflowed with cheese, bread, and wine were quieter now, their shelves half empty, though sometimes, if you were lucky, you could find a bit of chestnut paste or a small piece of dried sausage, enough to make a meal feel special. The few stalls still open sold candles, paper decorations, and cheap toys carved from wood, little horses and soldiers, which parents would buy to hide beneath the tree, even if there was no tree at all, just a small branch stuck in a bottle, wrapped in silver paper from a saved chocolate bar. And yet, despite it all, there was something extraordinary about that Christmas, something tender in the way people refused to give up the idea of celebration. In churches that had remained cold and empty through years of war, bells rang again, slowly, their echoes rolling across the rooftops. People walked through the cold streets to midnight mass, their coats buttoned to the chin, their steps slow but steady, children clutching their parents' hands tightly, as if afraid the moment might vanish if they let go. The pews were crowded with soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms, Americans, British, Canadians, men far from home who had liberated this city only a few months before. Some carried small tins of food to share, others offered chocolate or cigarettes to the children outside, who accepted them with shy smiles and wide, curious eyes. The mixture of accents filled the air like a strange kind of carol, English, French, Polish, Italian, a chorus of exhausted relief after years of silence and fear. Inside, the church smelled faintly of wax and damp stone, and when the organ began to play, many wept quietly, not from sadness alone, but from the overwhelming sense of simply being alive to hear it again. The candles flickered across tired faces, across uniforms and scarves, across eyes that had seen too much, and in that fragile light for a few moments the war seemed to loosen its grip on their hearts. After the Mass, people lingered outside, talking in low voices, their breath visible in the freezing air. Some sang softly old songs that everyone knew, while others just listened. Somewhere in the distance, the Seine flowed dark and steady under its bridges, its waters carrying the reflections of faint lights and the muffled rhythm of church bells ringing midnight. And in one small apartment not far from the river, a woman placed a single candle on her windowsill. As many others did that night, each flame a quiet signal that Paris was still here, still alive, still capable of light. In a narrow apartment on Rue de la Huchette, where the walls were thin and the cold crept in through the cracks, a family of 4 was gathered around a small wooden table, the kind of table that had seen too many winters, its surface scarred by time and the quiet rituals of survival. The mother, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, moved slowly between the stove and the table, her hands rough from washing and from the bitter winter air, yet gentle in their purpose. On the stove, a small pot simmered, a thin soup made from bones saved through the week, a single carrot, a handful of barley, and a secret pinch of herbs she had traded for a piece of bread 2 days before. The children, a boy and a girl, whispered to each other about presents they had dreamed of, but knew would not come. Still, they pretended. The boy claimed he had seen Father Christmas on the street that morning, disguised, of course, as a tired man in a long coat, carrying a sack that looked suspiciously like a soldier's bag. The girl giggled, though her voice was quiet, careful not to wake the baby sleeping in the corner wrapped in a coat instead of a blanket. Their father sat near the window, his eyes on the street below where the snow had started to fall, slow and heavy, blanketing the rubble left from the summer's fighting. He had returned from the front only weeks ago, his uniform replaced by a threadbare jacket, his face thinner, his silence longer. When he looked at the children, there was pride in his eyes, but also something else, the weight of everything he could not explain to them, the parts of the war that would never fit into bedtime stories. On the table, instead of a feast, there was a loaf of dark bread and a jar of beetroot preserved months ago, a small tin of sardines, a rare gift from an American soldier who had helped repair the roof, and at the center, a candle stuck into a bottle, its wax dripping slowly down the glass. Around it, they placed scraps of paper the children had colored with bits of charcoal. As they ate, the mother began to hum a carol, one she remembered from her own childhood before the war. Her voice was low and warm, and though she forgot some of the words, the melody lingered, filling the little room like a soft blanket. The father joined quietly, his voice rough from smoke and cold, and soon the children followed, their laughter breaking through the song like sunlight through a cloud. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The war, the hunger, the fear, all of it faded behind the rhythm of their small voices. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the streets, the rooftops, even the scars left by bombs, as if the city itself were being wrapped in silence and forgiveness. And when the candle finally burned low, the mother whispered a prayer she hadn't dared to speak in years. Not for victory, not for plenty, but for peace. That night, when the children fell asleep, the father stayed awake a while longer, sitting by the window watching the snow settle on the street. In the distance, he could hear faint laughter from other apartments, the creak of doors, the sound of someone playing a violin softly, imperfectly, but with feeling. Paris was breathing again, slowly, unevenly, like someone learning to live after a long illness. And though the city was still cold, still wounded, its heart was beating. By morning, the snow had stopped, leaving the city wrapped in a pale stillness that seemed almost unreal after so many restless nights. The streets of Paris, still half ruined, half alive, shimmered faintly under a thin layer of frost, and the sky above was the color of milk, soft and dim. People began to step outside, wrapped in scarves and heavy coats, their boots crunching quietly over the snow. The city was quiet, but not in the way it had been during the occupation. This silence was gentler, filled not with fear but with fatigue, and underneath that fatigue a quiet kind of hope. Cafes that had been shuttered for years were opening their doors again, their windows fogged with steam from freshly boiled coffee substitutes, made not from real beans but from roasted barley and chicory. The aroma drifted faintly through the air, mixing with the smell of coal smoke and fresh bread from a bakery that had somehow survived through everything. Inside, people stood shoulder to shoulder, sharing warmth, exchanging news, and offering each other small, tired smiles. On the boulevards, the Allied soldiers were out too, walking in groups, their uniforms dusted with snow, their breath forming white clouds in the cold. Some carried small parcels, gifts sent from home or traded with Parisians, tins of butter, sugar, chocolate, even oranges from somewhere far away. They handed them to children who followed them down the street, shy at first, then laughing when the soldiers smiled back. For many of those children it was the first time they had tasted sweetness in years. A few soldiers stopped to help rebuild a market stall that had collapsed under the snow. Others joined Parisians in sweeping the steps of a church, or carrying firewood for old women who lived alone. In those small gestures you could feel the city trying to remember kindness, as if generosity too had been rationed during the long years of war. The shop windows, though still mostly bare, showed signs of life. In one, a dressmaker had placed a single red ribbon on display, tied neatly into a bow. In another, a toy train made from scrap metal rested beside a sign that read Noël de Liberté, a Christmas of freedom. It wasn't luxury that made these things beautiful, but what they meant, proof that imagination had survived, that people were still trying to create joy from what little they had. As the day went on, the city grew a little louder. The bells rang again from Notre Dame, their sound echoing along the Seine. Couples walked hand in hand along the bridges, their footsteps slow, as if savouring every moment of calm. The river moved steadily beneath them, carrying bits of ice downstream, reflecting the faint light of a sun struggling to break through the clouds. And everywhere, in small, almost invisible ways, people were celebrating, not with champagne or grand feasts, but with warmth, with survival, with the knowledge that they had lived through something that could have broken them and hadn't. That night, in the same quiet apartments, families lit their last candles and whispered stories of the day. Children showed their treasures, a chocolate bar, a small wooden toy, a ribbon, while parents exchanged glances that said more than words could. Outside, Paris was glowing again, faintly, like a lantern kept burning in a storm. It was not a grand Christmas, nor a joyful one in the way the world once knew, but it was real, built from courage, from memory, and from the unspoken promise that peace, though fragile, might one day take root again. And as midnight came once more, the bells echoed softly across the rooftops, not triumphant but steady, reminding everyone who heard them that even after the darkest years, light has a way of returning, not all at once but gently, like snow settling over the wounds of an old city, bringing silence and rest. As the days of late December passed, Paris began to move with a rhythm both weary and tender, as though the city itself was slowly learning how to breathe again, after being held underwater for too long. The mornings came grey and cold, with frost crawling up the inside of the windows like ghostly vines, and the air was so crisp that every sound, a cart rolling down the street, the creak of a door, the laughter of a child, seemed sharper, purer, echoing farther than it should. In the narrow alleys of Montmartre, women with scarves tied over their heads lined up before dawn for the daily ration of bread. They spoke in quiet voices, sharing bits of gossip and rumour, their breath visible in the cold, and though the queue moved slowly, there was patience, even grace in the way they stood together. Somewhere nearby, a man played an accordion softly, his notes trembling in the air, rising over the faint hum of conversation. The tune was familiar, old, a pre-war melody that made some of the women smile faintly, though their eyes glistened. It wasn't happiness exactly, more like the delicate ache of remembering what happiness used to feel like. In the markets along Rue Muffard, the smell of roasted chestnuts mixed with a bitter tang of smoke from cheap coal. Merchants in patched coats stood beside their stalls, their hands red from the cold, their smiles tired but sincere. There were fewer things to sell now. Turnips, a few apples, maybe a rabbit if one was lucky. But the stalls were decorated with bits of pine, with old ribbons saved from better times, and sometimes a scrap of coloured fabric cut into the shape of a star. Children pressed their faces against the counters, their eyes wide, their noses pink from the cold, and the vendors would slip them small gifts when their parents weren't looking. A walnut, a sugar cube, a piece of orange peel dipped in syrup. Everywhere there was this quiet conspiracy of kindness, a silent agreement that the city deserved tenderness. After so many years of cruelty, people held doors open, shared coal, left half-loaves of bread for neighbours who had less. In the courtyards of old buildings, men repaired bicycles, women scrubbed windows, children played in the snow with tin spoons and buttons for toys. And when night came, the city softened even more, not into darkness, but into a warm hush that felt almost sacred. The streetlights were few and dim, but behind the curtains of countless windows, faint glows appeared one by one, like stars returning to a sky that had forgotten them. In some homes, a single candle burned beside a framed photograph of someone still at the front, or someone who would never return. In others, people gathered with neighbours, passing around small cups of ersatz coffee and sharing memories of what Christmas had been before ration cards and fear. The smell of boiled cabbage, of coal dust, of candle wax, all mixed together, not unpleasantly, but familiarly, like the scent of endurance itself. And through it all, Paris, wounded, hungry, half-lit, seemed to carry itself with an almost impossible dignity, a kind of quiet pride that no occupation, no hardship, no cold could take away. On the bridges over the Seine, lovers leaned close against the wind, their breath mingling in the freezing air, their laughter muffled by scarves. The river below them reflected the faintest lights from the quays, shimmering like broken glass beneath the current. From time to time a soldier passed, boots clicking, rifle slung over his shoulder, and nodded politely as he went, his face softened by the peace he had fought to earn. And in one small square near the Latin Quarter, an old man sold paper stars, cut by hand from scraps of newspapers. Each one was slightly different, crooked, uneven, but beautiful in its imperfection. He told those who bought them that they brought good luck. Porte bonheur, he would say with a wink, and the people smiled, tucking them into their pockets or pinning them above their beds. By Christmas Eve, nearly every window on the street had one. It wasn't the glittering Paris of postcards, nor the grand feasts of old, but it was something deeper, quieter, a a city rediscovering its humanity, one act of kindness at a time. And as the evening shadows lengthened and the bells began to ring again in the distance, echoing softly across the rooftops dusted with snow, the people of Paris paused, just for a moment, to listen. The sound was not triumphant, not joyous, but steady and patient, like the heartbeat of a city that had survived. As December wore on, Paris began to move with a rhythm both weary and tender, as if the city itself were learning to breathe again after being held still for too long. The mornings came pale and brittle, frost gathering on the inside of windows like thin white lace, and the air outside carried that hollow echo only winter knows. The sound of footsteps, of distant wheels creaking, of water dripping from rooftops as the first sun touched the ice. In Montmartre, women in heavy coats stood quietly in line before the bakeries opened, their hands tucked into worn gloves, their breath forming small clouds in the air. They murmured to one another about ration cards, about their husbands at the front, about children who had grown taller since the last Christmas, without ever having tasted real chocolate. Sometimes, from somewhere nearby, an accordion played, soft and hesitant, a familiar pre-war tune that seemed to rise from the cobblestones themselves, and for a few moments it made the city feel almost whole again. Down at the markets along Rue Mouffetard, the air smelled of roasted chestnuts, boiled cabbage and smoke from cheap coal. The merchants, wrapped in layers of mismatched scarves, sold what little they had: a few apples, a handful of carrots, a rabbit hanging from a hook, its fur dusted with frost. Children pressed their faces against the counters, eyes wide and shining, and when their parents turned away, the vendors slipped them small treasures: a sugar cube, a walnut, a thin slice of orange peel saved from a rare ration. It was a quiet rebellion against despair, this secret kindness passed from one tired hand to another, a refusal to let the season go dark entirely. In the courtyards behind old stone buildings, people patched clothes, repaired shoes, and gathered broken bits of wood to feed the stoves that barely kept out the chill. The smell of smoke mingled with soap and damp laundry, and above it all the faint hum of a city trying in its own way to remember how to live. By evening, when the light faded to silver and the street lamps flickered to life one by one, Paris became a constellation of windows glowing softly in the cold. Behind each of them a story unfolded: families eating together in silence, neighbors sharing coal, someone reading aloud by candlelight, someone else whispering a prayer for the missing. The city had grown thin but not fragile, wounded but still proud. It had learned to survive on almost nothing, and still find beauty in small things, in the curl of steam from a teacup, in the laughter of children echoing through a stairwell, in the sound of a church bell muffled by snow. Lovers met on the bridges over the Seine, their breath mingling in the cold, their voices low, their hands hidden in their pockets, and when soldiers passed them on patrol, boots clicking against the stone, they nodded quietly, each acknowledging the other's silent longing for peace. Near the Latin Quarter, an old man stood each evening beside a cafe that no longer served real coffee, selling paper stars he had cut by hand from old newspapers. The ink left smudges on his fingers, and each star was slightly crooked, but the people bought them anyway, tucking them into their coats or pinning them above their beds. He told everyone they were for luck, though most of them didn't believe in luck anymore, yet they smiled and thanked him as if they did. By Christmas Eve, the entire street shimmered faintly with those uneven stars, glowing behind frosted glass. Paris was not the same city it had been before the war, but it was alive, quietly, stubbornly alive. The sound of bells drifted once more through the air, their tones soft and unhurried, echoing between the rooftops and the river. And though the people were tired and cold and hungry, they paused to listen, because in that simple sound there was something that felt almost like grace, something that reminded them that even after years of silence and fear, there could still be music and light and the promise of another morning. That night, the 24th of December, Paris was cloaked in a soft, whispering snow that fell without wind, drifting through the streets like powdered silence. The lamps along the boulevards glowed dimly through the haze, halos of gold trembling in the frozen air, and beneath them the city moved slowly, deliberately, as if each person were afraid to disturb the fragile stillness that had settled after so many years of noise and fear. The Seine was a dark ribbon of glass, its surface half frozen, reflecting the faint lights of passing soldiers, of horse-drawn carts creaking across bridges, of the occasional automobile carrying officers through the night. In the narrow streets of Saint-Germain, music began to drift out from behind heavy doors. A violin here, a harmonica there, played by hands that trembled both from cold and memory. In one cafe, its windows fogged and cracked. A group of Allied soldiers sat with Parisians, sharing tins of coffee, cigarettes, and laughter that came hesitantly at first and then easier, like breath returning after a long illness. On one table, someone had placed a small pine branch in an empty wine bottle. Someone else had tied a red ribbon around it, and for a moment it looked like a tree, modest and perfect in its simplicity. A woman sang softly, her voice husky from smoke, and though no one knew all the words, they hummed along, their heads bowed, eyes half closed, letting the melody fill the spaces where words failed. The city's churches glowed faintly from within. At Notre Dame, the bells began to toll, deep and resonant, echoing across the icy rooftops and over the silent river. People walked slowly toward the sound, wrapped in heavy coats, their boots crunching on the snow. Many had no candles, no gifts, nothing to bring but themselves, but they came anyway, drawn by something wordless, the need to stand together, to feel that life, however fragile, was still sacred. Inside, the air was cold and damp, smelling of wax, of old stone, of winter breath. The pews filled quietly, row by row, women with shawls, children clutching scraps of bread, men in worn uniforms sitting shoulder to shoulder with young American soldiers who crossed themselves awkwardly in imitation of the locals. When the choir began, the sound was unsteady, like the voice of someone who has not spoken in years, but as it rose it gathered strength, echoing off the vaulted ceiling, mingling with the hum of muffled sobs and quiet prayer. The organ groaned into life, its notes spreading through the nave like warm smoke, and in that moment, even those who had lost their faith found themselves standing straighter, eyes lifted, hearts beating in time with the rhythm of the song. Outside, snowflakes drifted through the open doors, catching the candlelight and melting instantly as they touched the air, like tiny souls finding rest. When the mass ended, no one wanted to leave. People lingered on the steps, speaking in low voices, their breath misting in the cold. Soldiers handed out chocolate and cigarettes. Children gathered around them, wide-eyed, laughing softly. Some women carried baskets with small loaves of bread or jars of jam, sharing them with strangers, as if the act itself were a prayer. In one corner, an old priest with trembling hands blessed each passerby with a whispered bonne nuit, and people smiled, small, tired smiles, but real ones. Down by the river, a group of men built a small fire from broken crates. They stood around it with tin cups of weak wine, trading stories of homes they might never see again. Above them, the bells rang again, slower now, deeper, like the heartbeat of the sleeping city. And somewhere in a small apartment nearby, a family placed a candle in the window, as others did across Paris, hundreds of tiny flames glowing against the dark. Seen from the bridges, they looked like constellations scattered across the city, each light a quiet declaration that life in all its fragility had endured. And so the night deepened, and the snow fell, and the city, weary but unbroken, dreamed of peace. Not loudly, not with celebration, but softly, like a whispered promise carried on the cold air. A promise that when morning came, the world might finally begin again. Christmas morning rose over Paris in a pale light, soft and colourless at first, the kind of light that does not so much illuminate as gently reveal, spreading across the rooftops dusted with snow, and glinting faintly on the icy edges of the Seine. The city awoke slowly, as if afraid to disturb its own dream. The air was sharp and silent. Even the crows that perched on the chimneys seemed subdued, their cries muted by the thick frozen sky. Inside the old apartment blocks, fires had gone out during the night, and the air was cold enough to make breath visible, curling in the stillness like smoke. In one of those buildings, in a small room with frost gathered on the window pane, a mother was stirring a pot of chicory coffee on the stove, its bitter aroma filling the air, mingling with the faint scent of coal dust and wool. Her children woke to the sound of spoons against tin cups, their faces pink from the cold, but their eyes wide with the quiet excitement of morning. There were no wrapped presents waiting for them, no piles of toys or sweets, but the mother smiled as she reached into a cupboard and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in brown paper, 2 apples, a piece of sugar, and a tiny carved horse made from scrap wood, painted the night before with a brush dipped in ink and wine. The children's laughter filled the room, light and unrestrained, echoing off the cracked walls like a hymn. Outside, in the narrow streets, people were emerging from their homes, bundled in layers of scarves and coats, some carrying baskets, others walking arm in arm. The snow underfoot was thin and wet now, darkened by soot and footprints, but still beautiful in the early light. The bells of St. Sulpice rang faintly through the cold air, and the sound seemed to travel farther than usual, bouncing off the stone facades and vanishing into the grey mist over the river. From the windows, thin trails of smoke rose, curling lazily upward, fragile signals of life and warmth returning to a city that had almost forgotten both. In the cafes that had opened, soldiers and civilians sat together at small tables, shoulders brushing, sharing what they had. The Americans brought tins of butter and powdered milk, the British shared biscuits, and the French brought bread, dark, coarse, but warm. It was not a feast, but there was something about the way they passed the food, the way they spoke in quiet tones despite their different languages, that made it feel sacred. Someone produced a radio, and from its crackling speaker drifted the faint sound of a carol sung in English, its melody fragile but bright. People stopped talking and listened. A few hummed along. A young woman began to cry quietly, her tears glinting like glass in the half-light. Along the Seine, children ran beside the soldiers, their wooden toys clutched in their mittens, their laughter carrying over the water. Some of the men handed them sweets. Some took photographs. Some simply watched in silence, smiling with a softness that seemed to surprise even themselves. And though the city was scarred, with bullet holes still marking the walls, and bridges still guarded by armed patrols, there was a strange gentleness in the air, as if for this one morning, everyone had agreed to forget the war, just long enough to remember how it felt to live without fear. By noon, the sky had brightened slightly, and the smell of food, modest but comforting, began to drift from kitchens, boiled potatoes, a bit of sausage, a crust of bread warming in the oven, and if one was lucky, the faint sweetness of jam. Families gathered around tables where there were more empty chairs than before, but also more laughter than there had been in years. They spoke in low voices, sometimes pausing mid-sentence as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace, but there was warmth in their eyes, the warmth of people who had survived, who had seen the worst and still found reason to smile. In the afternoon, the streets filled again. People walked slowly along the boulevards, their cheeks red from the cold, some carrying small gifts or flowers, others simply walking because it felt good to walk without fear. The cafes played music on old gramophones, and from time to time someone began to dance, clumsy, hesitant steps, boots sliding on the wet cobblestones, and others joined in, laughing softly, clapping their hands, as if remembering something their bodies had forgotten. It wasn't celebration in the grand sense, but something quieter, deeper, a return to life itself. As evening approached, the sky turned lavender, and a faint golden light touched the domes and spires of the city. The bells began to ring again, slow and solemn, echoing across the rooftops, across the bridges, across the water. And in that sound there was something that no one could quite name, a mixture of grief and gratitude, memory and hope, the heartbeat of a city that had suffered but refused to die. And so Paris, exhausted and beautiful, carried itself into that Christmas night not with triumph but with peace, fragile and precious like a candle held against the wind, burning quietly in the dark. By the time the sun slipped beneath the horizon, the sky above Paris had turned a deep smoky blue, the kind of twilight that seems to hum softly, as if carrying all the memories of the day within it. The snow that had fallen overnight was melting now, leaving the cobblestones slick and glistening under the glow of street lamps. A light fog hung over the Seine, blurring the edges of the bridges and softening the shapes of people passing by. The city felt slower, quieter but alive, pulsing gently like a heartbeat muffled by distance. In the apartments above the streets, candles burned again, small trembling lights framed by curtains. Behind each window there was a story, lovers sitting close beneath a blanket, a mother reading to her children from a book missing its last pages, a soldier writing a letter on hotel stationery, his hand still stained from the front. The letters were simple. I am alive. The city is beautiful. I hope you are warm. Some added that they could hear music from the streets, or that they had been given chocolate by a stranger. They did not write about the scars still visible on the buildings, or the fatigue in their bones. They wrote about the light, the laughter, the smell of roasted chestnuts in the air, because it was Christmas, and even truth deserved to rest for one night. Down in the cafes, the mood was soft and golden. A gramophone played old waltzes, its sound grainy but warm, and the air smelled faintly of tobacco, candle wax, and soup. Soldiers from Canada, Britain, and America sat shoulder to shoulder with Parisians, passing around bottles of wine that had somehow survived the years of occupation. Some laughed, some spoke too loudly, some stared quietly into the glass, their eyes far away. At one corner table, a young Frenchman and an American soldier clinked tin cups together, exchanging words neither fully understood, but both felt. Nearby, a woman in a red scarf began to sing La Vie en Rose, her voice fragile, trembling on the high notes. But when the room fell silent to listen, she smiled, shyly, gratefully, and the song floated out through the open window, melting into the cold night air. Outside, in the square near Montparnasse, a few people had gathered around a makeshift tree, a bundle of pine branches tied together and decorated with paper stars. Children ran in circles, their laughter sharp and bright, their boots kicking up little sprays of snow. A soldier knelt down and handed a girl a candy wrapped in gold foil. She looked at it for a moment as if afraid to believe it was real, then smiled and ran back to show her mother. A few steps away, two men danced awkwardly to music played on a harmonica, their breath visible in the air, their laughter echoing through the narrow streets. And all across the city the same small miracles unfolded. A baker gave away his last loaf of bread to a woman with a child. An old violinist played beneath a street lamp, his case open and empty, but his music unwavering. A nun from a nearby convent walked through the cold, handing out candles to anyone who passed her. No one called it generosity, and no one asked for thanks. It was simply what people did when there was nothing left to lose except kindness. As the night deepened, Paris began to glow. Not from electricity, for there was little of it, but from the quiet fire of human presence. The river reflected that light, scattered and broken like a mirror that had survived a fall. The bridges were empty now, save for the occasional patrol or a couple leaning close against the wind. The air carried the faint sounds of laughter, of distant music, of a church bell ringing far away, not perfectly in tune, but steady. And high above it all, in a garret room near Montmartre, a young artist sat by his window, sketching by candlelight. His paper was rough, his pencils worn to stubs, but his hand moved gently, tracing the shape of the rooftops, the chimneys, the faint plumes of smoke that rose into the night. On the corner of the drawing he wrote the date, Noel, 1944. Then he paused, listening to the muffled hum of voices below, to the heartbeat of the city that had survived, and smiled faintly to himself. The candle flickered, the snow fell again, and Paris, tired but alive, kept dreaming beneath the quiet sky. As the night deepened, The city settled into a rhythm that was neither silence nor sound, but something in between, a low, steady murmur that seemed to come from the stones themselves, from the walls that had seen too much and yet still stood, from the rooftops that exhaled thin trails of smoke into the frozen dark. The snow, falling again now, caught in the yellow circles of light beneath the lamps, drifting lazily downward before vanishing into the black water of the Seine. Somewhere, faintly, a train whistle echoed from the outskirts of the city, long, mournful, fading into the distance, and for a moment it sounded almost like a hymn. In a small hospital near the Place de la République, a nurse moved quietly through the corridor, her shoes barely making a sound on the worn tile floor. The war wounded slept in rows, some dreaming, some stirring, their faces turned toward the faint light that slipped through the curtains. She paused at one bed where a young soldier, no more than 19, lay awake, his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. She smiled softly and placed a hand on his arm, whispering something that only he could hear. He didn't reply, but his breathing slowed, and when she moved away, she hummed to herself, a lullaby she remembered from her own childhood Christmases in the countryside. The melody floated through the ward like a memory of warmth, mingling with the smell of iodine and burning coal. Across the city, in a dim railway station where trains no longer ran on time, a group of refugees had gathered for the night. Families wrapped in blankets sat close together beside cold stoves, their few belongings stacked neatly at their feet. A man with a violin case opened it, not for coins but for comfort, and began to play, slowly, hesitantly, a waltz that once filled the salons of Paris before the war. The sound rose and echoed under the high, curved ceiling, filling the space with something that felt like the ghost of hope. A little girl twirled clumsily on her bare feet, her laughter soft and high, and for a moment even the soldiers standing watch smiled, looking away as if embarrassed by their own tenderness. In Montmartre, the wind carried the scent of roasted chestnuts and cheap wine. People huddled around small fires built in metal barrels, their faces glowing orange in the flickering light. Someone passed around a bottle, someone else tore a loaf of bread into pieces and shared it without a word. A man in a beret told a joke, a story about the Germans, the ration cards and the absurdity of the world, and the laughter that followed was real, rough and human, the kind that warms more than fire ever could. Above them, from a shuttered window, a record played quietly, the scratchy voice of Edith Piaf singing through the static, her words rising and falling like a sigh. Along the riverbank, soldiers walked their night patrols, their boots crunching on the frozen ground, their breath pale against the dark. Some stopped on the bridges to lean on the rails, looking down at the slow water. The city looked different from up there, softer, smaller, almost fragile. In the distance, the silhouette of Notre Dame stood against the clouds, its towers half hidden by mist, its bells silent now, as if resting after the long day. The men said nothing, they simply watched, their rifles slung over their shoulders, the reflection of the moon rippling faintly below. And in one attic room not far from the Sorbonne, a woman sat by her window, sewing by candlelight. Her fingers moved slowly, repairing the sleeve of an old coat, though her eyes kept wandering toward the city below. She could see the faint flicker of lights in the distance, the trails of smoke rising from chimneys, the soft blur of snowfall turning everything silver. On the table beside her sat a cup of cold tea and a letter from her husband at the front, written weeks before, edges worn, ink smudged, but read so many times it had become part of her. She didn't weep anymore. She only whispered to herself, "He will come home next year." And for the first time in months, she believed it might be true. Through the night, Paris breathed, through pain, through memory, through the quiet persistence of life. And though the cold deepened and the lights grew dimmer, there was a warmth that refused to leave, the kind that doesn't come from fire or feast, but from the steady hum of human hearts still beating in unison beneath the same weary sky. Past midnight, Paris was wrapped in a hush so deep it felt like a blanket drawn over the city's shoulders. The snow had thickened again, falling silently through the narrow alleys, settling on rooftops, on railings, on the empty cafe tables that glistened like mirrors under the weak glow of the lamps. The streets were nearly deserted now. The last soldiers had gone back to their quarters. The last church bells had long since faded, yet here and there, behind shuttered windows, small candles still burned, their flames trembling against the cold. The city was not asleep, not completely. It was resting, breathing, remembering itself. In a garret overlooking the Seine, a painter sat with his hands folded, his brush still wet, his canvas showing only the suggestion of a skyline, pale grey, half erased by the light of the candle beside it. He had stopped painting hours ago, but could not bring himself to blow out the flame. Outside, the sound of the river was steady, muted by snow, and from time to time the distant creak of a passing barge echoed through the quiet like a heartbeat. He thought of the years lost to fear, the friends gone without farewell, and yet, as he looked toward the dark water and the faint glow of the bridges, something inside him eased. He whispered to no one, "It is still Paris," and the words felt heavier and truer than any prayer. Elsewhere in a basement lit by a single lantern, 3 musicians, a violinist, a clarinet player, and a young woman with a battered accordion, were playing softly for themselves. They had no audience but each other, no reason, except that it felt impossible to let Christmas night pass without music. Their fingers were numb, their instruments slightly out of tune, yet the melody that wound through the air was heartbreakingly beautiful, slow, wistful, alive. It echoed faintly up the stairwell and into the empty street, where a stray cat paused to listen before vanishing into the snow. In the Marais district, an old baker woke before dawn, out of habit more than necessity. His bakery had been nearly destroyed the year before, but a single oven still worked, and so he lit it again that night, feeding it the last of his firewood, watching the flames take hold. The smell of baking bread began to spread through the courtyard, faint but unmistakable, curling upward into the frozen dark. It drifted through cracks in the shutters, into stairwells along the narrow lanes, a scent so ordinary, yet after years of war almost divine. People would wake later, hungry and amazed, thinking they had dreamed it. In the quiet rooms of hospitals, of convents, of boarding houses, people dreamed of things they could not yet say aloud, of trains that brought loved ones home, of dinners with more than one course, of laughter that didn't sound cautious. A few murmured names in their sleep, the names of those missing, of those remembered. Others slept with their hands still clasped, as if holding something invisible and precious, perhaps faith, perhaps the fragile belief that tomorrow might be gentler. Above it all, snow continued to fall, covering the wounds and the ruins alike, softening every hard edge, making even the scars look peaceful. The statues on the bridges wore pale white crowns. The rooftops shimmered faintly under the weak moonlight. The trees along the boulevards stood still as sentinels. The whole city seemed to be waiting, not for dawn, not for noise, but for something deeper and quieter, the kind of peace that arrives only when the body is too tired to hope, and yet still dares to dream. And somewhere, in that vast sleeping city, a radio crackled faintly in the dark. Through the static came the slow, fragile strains of a carol sung in English, the voice distant, carried from far across the channel. The words were barely audible, but the melody lingered, soft as breath, rising and falling with the snow. Paris listened, even in its sleep. When the first light of Christmas morning touched the rooftops of Paris, it came not in a blaze of colour, but as a gentle wash of silver and gold, seeping through the pale winter clouds like a breath returning to a sleeping body. The city, still wrapped in its blanket of snow, stirred quietly, as if afraid to wake too fast and frighten away the fragile peace that had settled overnight. Frost glittered on every window, and the chimneys began to smoke again, sending soft ribbons of grey curling into the frozen sky. The bells rang slowly, their tones uneven, echoing through the cold air and over the rooftops, calling to no one in particular. simply reminding the city that it was morning, that it was still here. Down on the narrow streets, the footprints from the night before had frozen into shallow impressions, and the first passers-by stepped carefully over them, their breath-forming clouds that lingered behind them like ghosts. The markets were opening again, though the stalls were bare. Vendors brushed the snow from their tables and smiled faintly at the sight of familiar faces. There were no grand displays, no garlands, no piles of oranges or chocolate, but there were greetings whispered with genuine warmth, hands clasped briefly in mittens, nods that said more than words. Someone handed out small paper flags, tricolours cut by hand from old magazines, and children waved them proudly as they followed their parents through the square, the paper fluttering weakly in the cold wind. From a distance came the faint hum of engines, the sound of army trucks moving toward the outskirts of the city, carrying supplies to villages still struggling after the retreat. Soldiers rode in the back, wrapped in heavy coats, some singing softly to keep themselves awake, others simply staring at the horizon where the light began to brighten. A few waved at the people who stood by the roadside, and though they didn't know each other, they smiled, strangers bound by the quiet miracle of being alive at the same time in the same fragile world. In one small apartment overlooking the Rue de Rivoli, a woman was setting the table for breakfast. The tablecloth was patched, the cups mismatched, but the smell of coffee, real coffee, a gift from an American friend, filled the air with a sweetness so rich it almost made her cry. Her husband, still in uniform, leaned against the window watching the snow melt from the eaves, his eyes soft and distant. Their children sat cross-legged on the floor, playing with the same wooden toys from the night before, their laughter echoing off the bare walls. For a moment it didn't feel like a city still healing from war. It felt like home. Outside, the world seemed to move slower. A man was sweeping snow from the steps of his shop, pausing now and then to look up at the pale sky. Across the street, an old woman fed crumbs to the pigeons that gathered near her feet, her face half hidden beneath a wool shawl. A baker opened his shutters and smiled at the line already forming by his door, not impatient, not desperate, just waiting. Inside, the smell of fresh bread was faint but heavenly, curling out into the cold and wrapping around those who passed like an invisible embrace. And through the quiet streets, music began to appear again, from a gramophone somewhere behind a half-open window, from a group of children singing off-key in the courtyard of a school, from the soft hum of a soldier with his hands in his pockets walking toward the river. None of it was loud, none of it perfect, but it was enough to remind everyone that the world could still sound beautiful. By midday, the city was awake, its heart beating softly but strong. People stood on bridges, looking down at the slow-moving river, watching the sunlight scatter across the thin sheets of ice. The water carried with it small fragments of wood, leaves, and bits of paper, remnants of the city's life drifting quietly away. Above them, the bells rang once more, steadier now, and the sound rolled through the air like a promise. And for the first time in years, Paris allowed itself to feel something close to joy, not loud, not reckless, but calm and full, like the warmth of a candle in cupped hands. As the day wore on, the pale winter sun drifted lower across the rooftops, spilling its light into the narrow streets where the snow had begun to melt into soft patches of grey. The stones glistened, and in every puddle the golden reflection of the sky shimmered like a secret, as if the city were quietly watching itself heal. The air was filled with a faint hum, the sound of doors opening and closing, of quiet laughter escaping through cracked windows, of pans clinking in small kitchens where something, anything, was cooking. Paris smelled of bread again, and of onions frying in butter, and of cheap wine warming in tin pots. It was not abundance, but it was comfort, and for once no one asked for more. Families gathered around tables that looked nearly bare but felt full. There were bowls of soup thin as water yet savoured as feasts, a few roasted potatoes browned in what little fat could be found, and in the centre, a loaf of bread cut into thick slices and shared equally. Sometimes a neighbour knocked at the door with a little extra, a spoonful of jam, a half bottle of wine, a piece of sausage, and there were no refusals. The plates clattered softly, and above them voices overlapped, retelling stories of older Christmases, of winters before the war when the city glittered with lights and laughter. No one pretended those years were coming back soon, but speaking their memory aloud made the present gentler, as if those vanished days had left behind a warmth that could still be felt through the chill. Children played on the stairwells, dragging small wooden toys by strings and inventing games that echoed through the buildings. The sound of their feet, the squeal of their laughter, the way they called to one another across the courtyards, all of it folded itself into the rhythm of the city, like a melody half forgotten but never quite lost. In the corner shops, people came and went, exchanging candles for bread, bread for coffee, and always parting with a quiet joyeux Noel that carried more weight than any gift could. As dusk approached, the sky dimmed to the color of pewter, and the windows began to glow one by one, small squares of amber light opening across the grey facades. From time to time, the door of a cafe swung open, and a gust of warm air rushed out, carrying with it the mingled scents of tobacco, wine, and laughter. Inside, the tables were crowded with a mix of soldiers and civilians, their faces red from drink and cold, their voices low but merry. Someone had found a battered accordion, and when it began to play, people clapped in rhythm. Couples stood to dance, boots sliding awkwardly on the worn floorboards, the music wobbly and beautiful. For a few minutes at a time, it felt as though the war belonged to another lifetime. Outside, on the boulevards, the street lamps flickered to life. Their light spilled over the damp cobblestones, turning the streets into long golden rivers that stretched toward the Seine. Groups of people strolled arm in arm, their shadows weaving together, their breath rising in white clouds that drifted upward and dissolved in the mist. Somewhere in the distance, the bells of Notre Dame rang again, not loud but steady, a heartbeat echoing through the fog. People stopped to listen. Some crossed themselves, others simply smiled and stood very still, letting the sound roll over them. And as night came once more, Paris seemed to draw itself inward, wrapping its light around its people. From above, it must have looked like a constellation scattered along the river, windows glowing, chimneys breathing, streets glinting faintly with ice. It was not a triumphant city, not yet, but it was alive, and that was enough. Inside, people lifted their glasses in quiet toasts to those who had returned, to those still gone, to the simple fact that another Christmas had come and found them still here. The wind outside softened, the snow began again in thin, wandering flakes, and for a long while the city made no sound but that of its own gentle breathing, slow, even, content. By midnight, the sounds of celebration had faded into whispers, the laughter from the cafes had thinned to murmurs, and the streets of Paris were nearly empty, the kind of empty that feels tender rather than lonely. The snow, which had begun again just after dusk, fell thicker now, each flake drifting slowly through the yellow glow of the lamps and settling softly on windowsills, on benches, on the stone ledges of bridges that curved over the silent river. The water moved steadily beneath them, dark and slow, carrying the reflections of the few lights still burning. Here a window, there a lantern left outside a doorway, each one trembling slightly on the surface before vanishing into the current. The air smelled faintly of smoke and melted wax, of bread gone cold, of pine branches drying in warm rooms. It was a scent that clung to everything, even to the stone walls, and it would linger long after the night was gone. Behind those walls people slept deeply, some still in their clothes, others under blankets patched and worn thin but warm enough. They slept as if the city itself were holding them, as if the weight of the years had finally lifted just enough to let them rest. In one room, a candle still burned beside a small nativity carved from wood, its flame flickering weakly, but refusing to go out. In another, two soldiers shared the corner of a narrow bed, their coats still on, their rifles propped against the wall, one dreaming, the other awake, watching the snow gather on the sill. Across the city, the bells lay silent now, their great bronze throats cooled by the cold night air, their echoes resting somewhere in the dark over the rooftops. In the hospital wards, nurses moved like shadows, pulling blankets higher over sleeping men. checking the stoves, whispering to one another in low voices that barely disturbed the quiet. In the convents, nuns prayed by candlelight for peace, not in words of triumph, but in words of weariness and gratitude, the kind that sound less like prayer and more like breathing. Far out near the edge of the city, in a field still marked by trenches and broken fences, the snow fell undisturbed except for the footprints of a single man walking home. His coat was frayed, his boots leaving deep prints behind him, but his head was lifted, his breath steady. In his pocket was a small loaf of bread, saved from the day's rations, in his other hand a folded newspaper he had found, the headline still speaking of war. But when he looked toward the faint glow of the city in the distance, the light of it reflected faintly on the clouds above, he smiled, not widely, not easily, but the kind of smile that comes when something inside begins to thaw after being frozen for too long. Back in the heart of Paris, on a narrow street near Montmartre, a cat walked the length of a wall, its tail cutting a soft line through the snow, its paws leaving prints like tiny punctuation marks in a sentence the city would never write down. From a nearby window came the faintest trace of a melody, someone humming to themselves, half awake, half dreaming, and for a few moments it seemed that the entire city was breathing in rhythm with that song. It was not a triumphant peace, not yet a new beginning, but it was peace enough to sleep through the night, peace enough for the wind to blow gently through the empty boulevards, without fear, peace enough for Paris to close its eyes and remember that it was still beautiful, even in its quietest hour. The snow continued to fall, erasing footprints, softening corners, settling over everything, like forgiveness itself, and the city, old, scarred, exhausted, but alive, dreamed beneath it, not of war or loss or even of victory, but of the simple, miraculous act of waking up again when morning came. The city glimmered beneath a layer of light so thin it seemed painted on, and for the first time in months the air didn't smell of smoke or damp stone, but of something clean and new. Along Rue Saint-Antoine, puddles mirrored the sky, blue where the clouds broke, silver where they lingered, and children, bundled in coats too big for them, splashed through them with shrieks of laughter that made passers-by stop and smile. The trams rattled again, creaking and groaning as they moved through the streets, their bells chiming faintly, blending with the steady rhythm of footsteps and market chatter. At a small stand near the Hôtel de Ville, a woman in a wool hat sold roasted chestnuts from a dented pan, her hands red from cold, her eyes bright as the smoke rose in lazy spirals around her. Men in worn coats crowded close to warm their hands, swapping bits of news. A cousin freed from a camp, a letter finally arrived, a rumor that the war might soon end. The woman smiled at each one of them, pressing an extra handful of chestnuts into their paper cones, pretending not to notice when they tried to pay with coins too few. The warmth of her stove reached their faces, and for a moment they lingered just to feel it. In the distance, church towers stood etched against a sky so pale it looked brittle. From their bells came a pattern of sound, uneven but steady, like breath caught between sigh and song. Somewhere on Boulevard Saint-Germain, a soldier played a harmonica while his comrades cleared the snow from the gutters, the music echoing between the shuttered buildings. The tune was cheerful but fragile, almost shy, like a child learning to speak again after a long silence. Inside the apartments, the rhythm of life had returned in quiet ways, the hum of a kettle, the scrape of a chair, the clatter of cups being washed. Women leaned from their balconies to shake out rugs and greet one another, their voices carrying across the courtyards. In one kitchen, a man was mending a broken clock, his wife humming as she set the table for the midday meal. In another, an old woman wrote a letter in careful script, stopping often to warm her fingers at a candle. The letters were always the same: gratitude, absence, the hope of next year. Down by the river, the bridges looked as though they had been carved from ice. Pigeons walked between the boots of pedestrians, pecking at crumbs, unbothered by the cold. Barges moved slowly under the arches, breaking the thin ice as they passed, sending ripples that caught the sunlight and shimmered gold for a moment before fading. A group of children watched from the quay, tossing pebbles into the water and cheering as the ripples met the current. The hours passed quietly, marked not by clocks but by small rituals. The smell of bread, the first call of a street vendor, the sigh of wind that slipped through narrow alleys. In the maraes, a violinist had set up beneath an awning, his case open at his feet. He played not for money but because his hands couldn't bear stillness, and his music rolled down the street like a thread of light weaving through the air. People paused to listen, not speaking, not moving, just breathing together in the thin sunlight. By the time afternoon faded, the colours of the city had deepened. The river turned the colour of pewter, the walls flushed with rose, the windows filled with long ribbons of reflected gold. It was not celebration that filled the streets, but something softer, quieter, the simple act of being alive and unafraid. In the square before Notre Dame, pigeons rose suddenly into the sky, hundreds of wings beating against the air at once, scattering snow and sound across the rooftops. A small boy stood below, watching them disappear into the light, and laughed so hard he stumbled backward into his mother's arms. She caught him, kissed his forehead, and whispered something only he could hear. And as the sun slipped behind the slate roofs, Paris seemed to pause, not out of sadness, but in recognition of itself. The lamps flickered to life one by one, the river turned to glass, and the last of the day's light gathered on the horizon like a promise too delicate to speak aloud. The light faded slowly that evening, not in a sudden fall but in long ribbons that slid down the stone facades and settled into the streets like silk. The lamps flickered on one by one, their halos stretching across the damp pavement, drawing out the shapes of people walking home, silhouettes moving through the golden haze, their steps unhurried, their voices low. The cafes filled first, behind fogged windows. Waiters moved between tables carrying tin pots of coffee and small glasses of wine. The murmur of conversation mixed with the soft scrape of chairs, the hiss of stoves, the rhythm of spoons against cups. Every sound seemed softer than it had before, as if the city itself was afraid to break the spell of calm that the day had left behind. Along the river, the bridges glowed faintly under a thin mist. Couples leaned over the rails, watching the water shift below them, its surface a tapestry of lights and shadows. A group of young men in worn coats passed a bottle between them, laughing quietly. The sound echoed and disappeared under the arch of the Pont Neuf. From somewhere farther down the embankment came the deep tone of a ship's horn, slow, resonant, almost mournful, and then silence again, the kind that seems to breathe. In Montmartre, a violin played behind an open window. The notes drifted into the street, mingling with the smell of roasted chestnuts and tobacco. Children followed the melody, their boots crunching on the thin crust of snow that had fallen again at dusk. They laughed and chased each other until their mothers called them inside, their voices echoing up the narrow staircases, disappearing into the warmth of the rooms above. In those rooms the air was thick with the smell of soap and bread, candles burned low, and the sound of soft conversation, ordinary talk of the next day, of errands, of ration cards, filled the spaces that once had known only whispers of fear. Down on the boulevards, the street vendors were packing up for the night. A man selling roasted chestnuts tipped the last of them into a paper cone and handed it to a boy waiting with his father. "For you," he said simply, and the boy's face lit up as if he'd been given treasure. Nearby, a newspaper seller set aside a copy of the day's edition and instead took out a small harmonica, playing a few notes that bounced off the closed shop fronts. The tune was clumsy but cheerful, and people passing by smiled without even realizing it. At the Gare de l'Est, trains stood still on the tracks, their metal frames glinting under the station lamps. Inside the waiting hall, soldiers sat on benches, some with letters in their hands, some asleep, their helmets beside them. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with paper stars and strips of tinfoil. Someone had tied a red ribbon around its trunk. A French nurse passed through the hall, her shoes clicking softly on the floor. She stopped by one of the men, placed a small packet of tobacco in his palm, and squeezed his hand before moving on. No one spoke. It was enough just to be seen. As the night thickened, the city's rhythm slowed. The laughter from the cafes became a murmur, the music dimmed, and the glow from the windows turned amber and soft. Above, the sky cleared, revealing a scatter of stars so bright they looked close enough to touch. The snow that had fallen earlier froze into a fine crust that sparkled under the light, turning the streets into ribbons of quiet silver. Somewhere in the distance, the bells of St. Sulpice began to toll, each note rolling through the cold air like a heartbeat. Inside a small apartment overlooking the Seine, a woman stood by her window, a shawl over her shoulders. She held a cup of tea that had gone cold and watched the reflection of the lights on the river. Across the water she could see other windows glowing, flickering faintly like fireflies in the dark. She didn't move for a long time. The city was breathing, slow, steady, alive, and for the first time in years it seemed enough simply to watch it do so. Sometime after midnight, the wind died down, and the city seemed to dissolve into its own stillness. The boulevards lay empty, their lamplight trembling faintly on the ice, the benches powdered in snow like forgotten sculptures. The air was heavy but gentle, carrying the faint hum of the river and the occasional creak of old shutters. Somewhere in the distance, a tram bell rang once, echoing thinly through the streets, and then there was nothing. No engines, no footsteps, no voices, only the quiet breathing of a city at rest. Along the Seine, the water moved with a slow rhythm, half frozen near the edges, carrying tiny fragments of ice that clinked softly as they touched. The bridges loomed like shadows across the current, their arches streaked with frost, their railings dusted in white. The statues that guarded them wore delicate crowns of snow, their faces tilted toward the sky as if listening for something. A single lantern still burned near the Pont Neuf, swaying faintly in the wind, its flame small but steady, a human heartbeat glowing in the vastness of the dark. In the alleys of Le Marais, the windows had gone dark one by one until only a few still shone. A candle left on a desk, a lamp forgotten in a stairwell, the dull orange of a stove through the crack of a door. Behind those walls people dreamed quietly. A seamstress slept with her needle still threaded beside her. A baker dozed in his chair, soot on his hands, the scent of bread still clinging to his clothes. A child turned in his sleep and whispered a word that sounded like Popper. In a narrow room above a shop, an old man sat awake, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the faint ticking of a repaired clock, the first sound of constancy he had known in years. Snow continued to fall, fine as ash, drifting against the rooftops and gathering on the iron balconies. Every surface glistened faintly, and the city seemed to glow from within, lit not by fire or electricity but by the soft reflection of its own memory. From the hills of Montmartre you could see the rooftops stretch in every direction, an ocean of white punctuated by chimneys breathing out thin trails of smoke, each one marking a family, a story, a pulse. The Sacré-Cœur stood above it all, its domes faintly luminous under the moon, as if watching over a city in fragile recovery. The cold deepened toward dawn. Ice bloomed on the windows like slow-growing flowers, and even the air inside the rooms had a sound. The faint crackle of settling wood, the hush of sleeping breath, the soft sigh of wind beneath the eaves. Time moved differently in those hours, not forward but outward, expanding into the quiet, stretching to make room for peace. Down by the river, a stray dog nosed through the snow, leaving small prints that wound their way along the embankment. He stopped, lifted his head, and looked toward the lights of the city centre, faint now, blurred by the mist, and for a long moment stood perfectly still, his ears tilted to the silence. When he moved again, the sound of his paws was the only rhythm in the world. Above him, the sky had cleared, revealing stars that glittered so sharply they seemed to ring. The moon hung low over the rooftops, pale and thin, watching. The city lay beneath it like a page that had finally been turned, and in the deep of that winter night, Paris slept, not as it had during the years of fear, but as something living that had found, at last, the courage to rest. Toward morning the darkness began to pale at the edges, a slow seep of grey that turned the rooftops from shadow into shape. The last stars clung to the sky, dim and cold, while far to the east a faint stripe of light stretched over the horizon, almost hesitant to return. The wind had quieted, the snow lay untouched across the streets, and the city seemed caught between sleep and waking, holding its breath in that thin space where night does not yet want to end. From somewhere deep inside the labyrinth of narrow streets came the first sound, a door creaking open, the rattle of a bucket, the low voice of a baker stoking his oven. The smell of yeast and wood smoke drifted into the air, fragile but alive, curling upward until it mixed with the cold. One by one, other sounds joined it. A kettle whistling, a broom brushing the steps, the soft clatter of a window being unlatched. Paris was stirring again, not with urgency, but with the slow rhythm of habit, the quiet pulse of ordinary life returning. On the bridges, the snow was marked only by the faint lines of last night's footsteps, already filling in with new flakes that fell like dust. A cart crossed the Pont Neuf, wheels squeaking in protest against the frost. Its driver hummed under his breath, the tune lost to the mist, but the sound itself felt like a sign of the day reclaiming the city. Across the river, the towers of Notre Dame emerged from the fog, their stone faces glistening with frost, their bells still silent but waiting. The sky lightened slowly, turning from grey to pearl to the palest blue. Smoke rose in soft columns from the chimneys, straight and steady in the windless air. At a corner cafe, a woman swept the threshold clean, leaving small arcs in the snow. She paused to look up at the sky, then smiled faintly before unlocking the door. The smell of coffee grounds followed her inside. Children were the first to break the stillness. They came into the streets wrapped in scarves and thick coats, their cheeks flushed, their laughter piercing the hush like birdsong. They threw snow at one another, their boots crunching through the powder, and soon the quiet was filled with shouts, with giggles, with the scrape of sleds on ice. Behind them, parents watched from doorways, arms folded against the cold, eyes soft with something that was almost disbelief, that such sound could exist again after so many years of silence. By the time the sun rose fully, the colour of brass through the morning haze, the city had awakened. Windows reflected light instead of lamplight. The streets sparkled with thin streams of melting snow. The river, freed of ice in places, carried ripples that caught the gold of the sky. In bakeries, people queued patiently, speaking in low voices, their hands wrapped around coins still cold from their pockets. A radio crackled somewhere, the voice distant but clear. News from the front, reports of progress, words that felt lighter than they had a week ago. And above all of it, Paris seemed to listen, not to the sounds themselves, but to what they meant, the proof that morning still came, that warmth still existed, that the city could wake from its long, fearful sleep. The bells finally began to ring, deep and slow, rolling across the rooftops, across the bridges, across the water. The sound was not triumphant, not yet, but steady. The heartbeat of a city alive again, welcoming the light. By the time the sun had risen high enough to reach the upper windows, the frost had begun to melt into slow-moving rivulets, tracing bright lines down the glass. The city glittered as if newly minted, rooftops flashing like coins, puddles shimmering with slivers of reflected sky, the stones beneath them still breathing out the night's cold. The warmth was slight, a trembling warmth, but it was enough to change the colour of everything. What had been grey turned soft, what had been still began to move again. In the courtyards, women beat rugs against balconies, their movements rhythmic, sending pale dust swirling into the air like smoke. From the streets below came the scrape of shovels and the low rumble of carts carrying sacks of coal, their wheels bumping along the cobbles. The sound was coarse but comforting, proof that work had begun, that life was continuing, that hunger and war had not broken the city's rhythm completely. Cafes opened their doors to the cold. Chairs were set out again on the sidewalks, their metal legs scraping faintly as they touched the stone. Men in threadbare coats stood at the counters, sipping the bitter chicory brew that passed for coffee, their breath mixing with the steam. Newspapers lay unfolded, their edges curling in the damp air. The headlines were still about battles far away, about shortages, about loss. But for the first time in years, people read them without lowering their voices, without glancing nervously toward the door. The bells of St. Clotilde began to ring at noon, their tone light and clear, like glass tapped gently by a fingertip. Children paused their games to listen. A few of them, barefoot in the snow despite their mother's scolding, tipped their heads back and laughed as the sound echoed through the narrow streets. One boy, his cheeks flushed red, pretended to conduct the invisible orchestra in the sky, his stick drawing wide circles through the air until his sister pulled him inside, giggling. By early afternoon, a thin mist had risen from the Seine, softening the outlines of the bridges and curling around the statues that watched over them. The water, freed from ice, moved more quickly now, carrying fragments of broken branches and a single wooden crate that bobbed gently along the current. A barge drifted beneath the Pont Neuf, its motor humming quietly, the reflection of its wake slicing the sunlight into trembling shards. In a small shop near the L St. Louis, an old man repaired watches at his counter, his magnifying glass perched on his nose. Each tick that returned to life under his hands seemed like a tiny victory, a heartbeat restored. The customers who came in spoke softly, as though afraid to disturb the delicate rhythm of gears and springs. On the wall behind him hung a faded calendar still marked 1940, but he hadn't the heart to replace it. The sound of ticking filled the room like breathing. Farther north, near Pigalle, an artist stood before a blank canvas propped against an open window. The cold rushed in, biting at his fingers, but he ignored it. Below him, he could see the rooftops spread out in rows, their chimneys trailing smoke, their slate tiles shining in the light. He dipped his brush in water and watched it freeze along the rim of the cup, smiled, and began to paint. The first stroke was hesitant, the second steady, and by the third the rhythm had returned, the same rhythm that filled the city that day, slow, imperfect, alive. As the day drew on, the sun sank behind the western rooftops, casting long shadows that stretched across the streets like quiet reminders of night. The temperature dropped again, and the snow began to glitter with the faint blue light of dusk. The air smelled of bread, of coal, of wet stone, of something faintly metallic and new. People walked home with their collars up and their hands deep in their pockets, talking softly as the first stars appeared above the chimneys. When the lamps were lit once more, Paris seemed less like a city of the wounded and more like a place that had learned to endure. The war was still far from over, the hunger still real, but beneath the weight of it all, something luminous persisted. The rhythm of footsteps, the smell of food, the sound of laughter carried down the street. The small, ordinary signs that the heart of the city had kept its beat. And above it all, unseen behind the thin clouds, the sky held a faint reflection of those same lights, as though even heaven that evening had chosen to glow a little warmer over Paris. As evening crept once more across the rooftops, the light faded not with sadness, but with a kind of mercy. The sky turned the colour of pewter, then rose, then deepened slowly into blue, and the last sunlight slipped across the snow, glinting in windows like the last line of a forgotten hymn. The city exhaled as it darkened, the day's noises softening into murmurs, the footsteps thinning, the smells of food and smoke settling low over the streets. The cafes filled again. Behind steamed glass, people leaned over their cups, voices hushed but warm, laughter rising now and then in sudden bursts. Soldiers, their uniforms dulled by salt and dust, shared tables with students and shopkeepers. Old men played cards by the light of oil lamps, their eyes reflecting the glow. A waitress hummed as she wiped down a counter, her tune blending with the faint hiss of a stove. On the walls hung paper garlands left from Christmas Day. curling slightly at the edges but still bright in the amber light. Outside, the boulevards shimmered beneath a fine layer of slush. The lamps flickered, the wind smelled faintly of coal and river water, and the city seemed to walk at its own pace, slower, gentler, deliberate. The laughter from the cafes drifted into the air, mixing with the whistle of a distant train and the dull rhythm of the river's current. From an open window, a gramophone played a waltz, the same record repeating because no one bothered to change it. In the small rooms above the shops, people wrote letters, some to sons still fighting, some to husbands who hadn't written in months, some simply to themselves, as though to keep alive the sound of their own names. The ink froze if left too long on the pen. The candle flames bent in the draughts that slipped through the walls. Yet there was patience in the way they wrote, as if time had finally become something generous again. On the streets below, a few children dragged sleds through the half-melted snow, their laughter echoing between the stone buildings. They did not know much of politics or hunger or fear, only that the war was farther away now than it had been last winter, and that the grown-ups had begun to smile again when they thought no one was looking. They built a crooked snowman by the gate of an empty courtyard and dressed it with a soldier's cap someone had lost. When they were done, they stepped back to admire their work and began to sing, off-key but proud, their voices rising through the cold air until it was impossible not to hear. The bells answered them. Not loud, not grand, but low and even, a handful of notes carried on the wind. They sounded less like ceremony and more like memory, not a summons to prayer but a reassurance that the city's heart was still beating, steady, alive. The children laughed louder. Someone clapped from a window. Someone else leaned out and waved. And as the snow began again falling in soft spirals through the lamplight, Paris folded itself once more into its winter calm, not silent but content, glowing faintly, as if the day itself had been a dream that refused to fade. By the next dawn, the snow had ceased completely, leaving the rooftops smooth and pale beneath the early light. Smoke rose from the chimneys in thin blue columns, drifting upward into a sky so clear that it seemed fragile, as though one breath could shatter it. The Seine moved quietly, steady and dark, carrying with it the glint of morning. The bells began again, one by one, the notes travelling slowly over the water, echoing through the empty boulevards. They no longer sounded like mourning, nor like triumph. They sounded like time itself, patient, forgiving, unhurried. The war still lived beyond the horizon, and everyone knew it. Yet in this moment it felt far away, as if the city had wrapped itself in a silence too gentle to be broken. Paris was no longer waiting. It was living again, tentatively but sincerely, as if rediscovering how to move through the hours without fear. Men and women crossed paths on their way to work, nodding politely, their glances calm and unguarded. Children pulled sleds across the squares, leaving lines that crisscrossed the snow like signatures. Soldiers leaned on railings, watching the river pass beneath them, their breath pale against the morning air. In the bakeries, the ovens glowed. The smell of bread spread outward in invisible waves, filling the streets with a warmth so deep that it made people stop and close their eyes for a moment before walking on. Somewhere, a violin played the slow, steady melody of a waltz, each note stretching out like a heartbeat, and when it ended, the silence that followed was not empty but full of breathing, full of life. A painter stood on a balcony overlooking the river. His easel was bare, his hands stained with yesterday's work, and he was not in a hurry to begin again. He simply watched as the city stirred beneath him, the light crawling over the bridges, the smoke dissolving into gold, the people appearing like shadows reborn in the glow. Somewhere below, a woman laughed, a brief, clear sound, and he smiled, lifting his brush at last. For a moment it seemed that everything, the snow, the smoke, the light, the sound of bells, the smell of bread, the hush of footsteps, had joined in a single rhythm, a rhythm that belonged not to war or to peace, but to endurance itself. Paris breathed in and out, quietly, deeply, its heart still bruised but whole, its soul warmed by the simplest of miracles that the morning had come, and they were all still here to see it. And so the city glowed, not brightly, not with celebration, but with that fragile, luminous kind of light that belongs only to places and people who have suffered and survived. For in that winter of 1944, Paris did not celebrate victory, it celebrated breath.